Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Unbuffered. I'm Christopher Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. This show is a little bit of a departure from our new show, from Unbuffered. As you know, I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. Talk about it at the beginning of almost every show. And I've talked a little bit about what happened when the federal government came to town and got up all in our grill here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the surrounding area, the not so surrounding area, the areas around the surrounding area, where we had a big response in order to protect our neighbors. There was I would say, significant overreach that I think most people have agreed with at this point. And I've had requests from people that listen to the show and others who would just be interested in having a kind of a candid conversation among some of the people that were involved with some of that. And so we've decided to do that. Now, I think it's worth noting that this show is about technology and how we organize society. It's about local self-reliance. And this is a story that is about that. And it involves technology. I'll talk a little bit about why. But fundamentally, this show is more of a recounting of what happened in the order that many of us experienced it and how we thought about it and how and why we think Minnesota reacted the way it did. That's what we're going to cover in this show. We're going to be pretty candid about politics. I deeply respect that people don't always agree with me. In fact, people rarely agree with me, it feels like sometimes. But I respect that people have different politics, different culture. And I want to say, if you are often annoyed when I start talking a little bit more about politics, about the Trump administration or other administrations, you might want to skip this show. That's fine. Our future episodes are going to be more focused on technology and less on politics and touchy situations. This is a deeply personal issue for me, the guests on the show today, and our neighbors. So I wanted to say that this topic is related to technology. In fact, I did say it. I'll say it again. And the federal government used technology in terms of how it acted. The federal agents were using a real cutting-edge technology in terms of identifying where their targets would be, and then also trying to identify their targets and make sure that they were actually the people that they were trying to get. That technology didn't often work. Wired covered a lot of that really well. They had some really good articles on that. The federal government used these technologies to get their message out. And the people that were responding, the citizens, the many people who were here, and I say citizens as people who take an ownership of the community, not necessarily people with a certain legal status. We use technology in ways that are very important. We were denied certain technologies in terms of how we tried to respond to keep ourselves and our neighbors safe. And so this is a story that is deeply technological, but I'm not going to hide behind that. This is a story in which we talk more about philosophy, what makes Minnesota react the way that it did. And then the last piece of technology that I wanted to mention, because I feel like data centers are so hot right now, is that being able to record video that you could get into the cloud and prevent the federal government from disappearing was very important over the course of this. And so we needed the data centers that were taking the video from our devices. We'll talk briefly about that in just a few minutes. We also, as a warning, just a sense of where we're going. In the course of this discussion, we think that we could not talk about why Minnesota responded the way it did without also talking about George Floyd and the aftermath of his death at the hands of the police. We start the show with covering the timeline of ICE coming to Minnesota and stepping up issues along with Border Patrol. And then we talk more about the Minnesota reaction, why it reacted the way it did. And in a previous show, my interview with Blair Levin, we ended talking about why we think this is all so important right now and why I think it's worth doing an entire show on. Nothing about this is meant to be definitive. This is three people who are all actually not Minnesota born. We're all non-Minnesota natives who came to Minnesota but have lived here for a long time and feel firmly rooted here now. And there's a lot of other people who were born in Minnesota who have different experiences. So we're not trying to take ownership of this or anything. We're sharing our experiences. Um, okay, so I want to cover the introduction. This I recorded later because I messed up the introduction when we first did it live with David and Lisa. You might be asking, who are David and Lisa? They are longtime Minnesota residents. David Brower is a longtime reporter in the Twin Cities. I've really enjoyed following him. I've followed him on Twitter for many years, and now I follow him on Blue Sky. He's got really good humor. He's asking hard questions of everyone, including those that he agrees with. I thought that his writings have been terrific for many, many years, probably decades. And he does identify himself as the chief rememberer of the 1991 blizzard. This is a seminal event in Minnesota living memory that is, you cannot go a year without it being brought up. So that's David. So welcome, David.
Thank you.
And Lisa is a longtime South Minneapolis resident, someone that I've known for many, many years. As ICE came to town and Border Patrol and Renee Good and Alex Preddy were shot, I would go back and forth with Lisa periodically because I wanted to know what she was seeing and hearing, and her conversations with her neighbors. I felt that her on the ground South Minneapolis view of this is really interesting and important part of the story, both now and in the years leading up to this, in terms of how neighbors related and things like that. So the conversations that I had with Lisa, to me, suggested that it would be important to include her as well. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us.
Hey, Christopher. Hey, David. So I just wanted to let David know that I also was here in 1991 for that blizzard. In fact, I had just gotten here in June of that year and that happened. And I thought, oh, my God, what did I get myself into?
You know, Lisa, that's a little bit like the people I've talked to who moved to Minnesota in like 2019 or early 2020, only to be confronted with a world historical event and then another world historical event, or who moved here just before, just before George Floyd. I thought moving to Minnesota was a nice, quiet, relatively well-educated place, and it turns out we just have a major global historical eruptions every 5 years now.
So with that, I have a rough timeline, and I'm expecting Lisa and David will be able to jump in a little bit, but I would put it back to like October, September, October timeframe. I think we have a sense from President Trump's, comments and truths and whatnot, that he's sending increased ICE into LA and other areas, eventually Chicago. I noticed in October was when Apple blocked Ice Block, which for me was a major part. But David, it looks like you might have had something earlier you want to note before we go into that.
Well, just in terms of the timeline, I mean, you can go back to Trump's election, or maybe his first election if you want to go way back. I would say, though, that local organizations in Minnesota, immigrant-led organizations, were planning for something like this over a year ago. There were efforts made in earnest immediately after Trump got elected, and they didn't always bear fruit. They weren't always seen by the public, let's put it that way. But I would say we're recording this at the very end of March, and I would say almost a year ago at this time, the small groups that were getting together were planning sort of what ifs and what do we do. And I can't say that they had very much of what ended up happening invented. This was obviously a widely distributed reaction to the federal invasion, but there were definitely a number of groups that were sort of laying the groundwork. The other thing, maybe more specifically to your point, is in June of last year, the federal government came in a multi-jurisdictional task force and raided a grocery in the Lake Street, Minneapolis, and Hiawatha Avenue area. And it was a raid where the Minneapolis Police Department basically tried to keep the public from intervening on the federal task force. The task force included local law enforcement, like the Hennepin County Sheriff, but we really saw that multi-jurisdictional amalgam of initials that the federal government subsequently threw at us. And we also learned at that time I think people like you may have known this before, but this was when the activist community really got hip to it, that uploading video, uh, while powerful, can also be a tool of the state in terms of identifying people that are defending themselves against the government. And about 2 weeks after that confrontation, I guess, somebody was arrested on the basis of video. And it really set the scene for a lot of people who were doing legal resistance subsequently to tell people live streaming is great. It's super attractive. It's sexy. It made all the difference in some cases, but we're going to really need you if you're going to do legal resisting and observing and providing evidence to actually send your video up to people who can review it first to avoid people being unfairly targeted.
Well, that's a good point. And I think that's one of the things where we'll see a number of nuances between options of how one acts and conducts themselves. We're gonna jump back into the timeline. And I did also want one other thing, which is that like I've always loved Minnesota. My family moved here from Pennsylvania, and we came here during a recession. Family needed a job, and Minnesota delivered in so many ways. I've been rooted here since. But Minnesota also had, we're not going to sit here and say Minnesota was perfect. Minnesota had a significant and has a significant problem with like I think if you are a young black man, you probably have a 50% chance of being involved with the criminal justice system. Same thing for people who are indigenous. We have challenges in Minnesota, whether you're in the rural or in the cities, with race and those issues. And I would say that this whole event really has made me love Minnesota all the more to see kind of like a reckoning and people coming together in that way. And I don't know that we would have necessarily guessed that. I wouldn't have guessed that several years ago, just because we're going to talk about how amazing Minnesota is, but I'll just say like there's things that we have to work on still. So December 1st, I feel like is where we really see the cannon pointed at Minnesota with vilification of people who are of Somali descent, which I say because in Minnesota we have, according to the numbers that I've seen, like 84,000 people who I think would identify as being Somali one way or another, but most of them are American citizens. They've been here for a long time. I played soccer in the 90s with a lot of Somali folks. They're well integrated in some ways, and in other ways, there's still neighborhoods that are very heavily immigrant and have that flavor about them. But they became a target of the president and others. And there was anyway this ratcheting up of rhetoric and whatnot over the course of December. Started seeing more whistles in response to federal efforts with raids in some of the neighborhoods that are more heavily Somali. If you remember, at the end of December, there was the viral video of the Somali daycare claiming that these daycares were frauds, and all of that turns out to be ridiculous, but it sort of keeps ratcheting up this sense that something's going on and justifying a greater number of people who are coming from the federal government, some of whom have been in these jobs for a while, some of whom seem to be hired recently. So that takes us to the end of December, more or less, and we end the year and start the new year with thousands of federal agents coming to Minnesota, primarily from ICE and Border Patrol. And of the two, I'll just say that a former person that worked with me at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Marin, did an amazing podcast called Bad Watchdog, 2 seasons about Border Patrol. Highly recommend it if you want to have a sense of just how messed up this agency is. I'm not going to paint with a too broad a brush. I'm trying not to, but like Border Patrol is a fundamentally broken organization in ways that ICE isn't necessarily. So there's some differences there. I would then jump to January 7th. We see more and more of ICE patrols, and in Minneapolis in particular, a response of people who are organized. And Renee Good is shot on January 7th. And this is something that happens, and then there's more and more footage coming out day after day. This is like I think that's like the first major flashpoint for some of us, where we're realizing that this is a much bigger thing than we thought. It's really getting bad. So let me pause there for a second, and just give Lisa or David a chance to weigh in about anything that you remember from those times.
I do remember when ICE and CBP raided the restaurant down on Lake Street that David was talking about, and the reaction of the local law enforcement. And I think that that was a bit of a realization that we were going to have to take care of ourselves, you know? And, later on, when the police chief came out and said that they were going to, arrest or they were going to interfere whenever CBP or ICE broke the law, it was a little encouraging, but I don't think the majority of people, especially people in the immigrant community, believed that to be the case. And um, as far as I could tell, it was not the case. And that was one of my frustrations is, I felt that there were so many instances when um, our local law enforcement could be helping us out, but they weren't. Um, I just thought that was incredibly frustrating.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would just add to that Mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Fry, who I think famously and appropriately basically told Trump to fuck off, got a lot of positive press for that. Um, followed up by saying, at least his police chief, who the mayor directly supervises, said that they would intervene when they saw ICE abuses. We've now learned through FOIAs, Bloomberg News did a good FOIA dump, that they absolutely did not intervene, and nor would they intervene. Um, so I would caution your national listeners who are excited about Jacob Fry to know that the walk is not nearly as strong as the talk, and it's depressing for those of us who live here to see him feted at the same time that really there's been no follow up. I want to go back on your timeline just a bit to remind viewers of a couple of things. One, this is sort of lost now in the recall, but uh, the reason that Trump started talking about Somalis again was because an Afghani national had uh, killed somebody, I believe, in Washington, D.C. And this started a whole little chain of the White House trying to leverage its immigrant hate over this issue. And of course, Trump's brain being slippy slips immediately to Somalia. Suddenly, as you, Christopher, as you mentioned, we're hearing about sending ICE after Somalis, which frankly everybody here laughed about because all the Somalis we know are citizens. Not everyone is, but overwhelming majority is. And I will say that you mentioned too the whistle campaign, which has been super successful, very noteworthy. That came really from Chicago, who had a much smaller ICE invasion. For perspective, Minnesota had like 4,000 ICE agents. I think Chicago had an awful invasion of like 250. So our invasion was about 50 times per capita of what Chicago faced. But Chicago learned from LA. And one of the things, and LA learned from Charlotte, which had happened. So there is this sort of rolling thunder that Minneapolis really benefited from. And we got the whistle kits, which included the whistles and when to blow them and what, like 3 short blows indicate that ICE is in the area, and then 3 longer blows indicate that they're right there. All of that came from someplace else. That was not indigenously invented. And so to people elsewhere in the country that think this is coming for them, please feel free to contact any of us who know what was going on in Minneapolis. If you need advice, if you need tactics, your tactics will be different. They will.
Right. And
And
this was
I can already tell you in Minnesota, the tactics that worked in Minneapolis and St. Paul do not work necessarily in the suburbs or rural Minnesota, but they did work here because of
right.
density.
Well, and that's the thing is actually, I think they work differently in even Minneapolis than St. Paul and in the suburbs because of organization. And I think we'll talk more about some of those differences toward the end. I had a frontline view of some of this. My wife is involved in with the PTO and for the school, for our kids' school, and so she was kind of watching what was happening, and we didn't reach out to others, and didn't, it's kind of funny. I believe strongly in the internet, try to make sure everyone has access to it. I never researched things like in my personal life. And so we were just sort of like, trying to get a sense of what was going on. I talked to people I'd been active with. I'd been a protester years ago, and involved in that. And so, like my wife, through the stuff that she was in, she jumped in, to try to organize some of the parents with school patrols and things like that. This is all happening right before Renee Good was shot, and then also right after, because also that same day, the ICE agents were at Roosevelt High School. And I think, Lisa, you might have had some personal experience with that. They seemed totally out of control. And that was a second part of the wake-up call on that day, I think.
I was not there that day. My kids graduated from Roosevelt a few years ago, but I could hear it. I was close enough to know that there
Mhm.
was something going on. And it was all over, Facebook. And the signal chats were talking about it. So I was
Yeah.
aware of it happening. Yeah.
So this is before the police department started doing press conferences, and we're still trying to, like, there's a fog going on to some of this to try to figure out what's happening and how are people reacting to it. But one of the things we saw was school principals and school security officers saying, "Please help." And when my wife was organizing this and reached out to the principal and the security officer to say, "Hey, we want to do this thing. We think that we want to have some visibility," I kind of expected them to be like, "Please don't. We're professionals." And instead, the reaction from every school I'm aware of was all the same, which was, "Thank you. Please work with us. Like, here's what we're looking for." And so for me, that was a sign that something was really different happening here and it was being perceived as a major threat. Later on, January 14th was when, that school that I'm familiar with had a walkout along with many other schools in St. Paul. They went to the Capitol. And that was the night that in North Minneapolis, a Venezuelan man was shot, which I will include here because it was also one of the signs that they were just lying about everything. The federal agents were. And we found out later that everything that they said about that encounter was not true. It was interesting. The other piece about that night that I thought was relevant is that, like, a few random people who gave quirky clips to the press became international sensations and then went on to do more of kind of like reporting on the ground in some ways. There's a guy who kept dropping the F-bomb who was just talking about he was a normal guy and he's just so pissed off that this was happening and this is ridiculous. He'll be forever memorable in my head.
The angry Minnesota guy.
Yes. Yeah. And talking about like, just like, he's never protested before and things like that. Later on in this middle of January, Mischief in Grand Avenue is handing out the whistle kits and all that. They get featured by ABC News and they get hit with an I-9 audit, where they start getting targeted. When the police chief for Brooklyn Park on January 20th says that his officers who were not white, when they were not wearing their uniform, were harassed and threatened by ICE agents, and details some of that just ICE agents are out of control. Later, the next day, Brooklyn Park sees an increased number of raids and they get punished for having spoken out about it. This is when we started seeing checkpoints on some of the highways and other places where ICE was asking people that they thought did not look Minnesotan, I guess, whatever that means, to provide ID and that sort of a thing. And there's videos in that then circulate on social media of members of indigenous tribes being harassed and taken, among others. Liam Cornejo Ramos, the child with the blue hat, is taken. Many of the children in his school district ultimately, or in his school specifically in Columbia Heights, are later threatened. This is all kind of giving us, we're freaking out. I mean, at least in my household, we're just like, this is escalating so rapidly. And yet there seems to be widespread condemnation, but it doesn't seem to matter. And I'll just say, like, I felt so powerless, like white man my whole life, like dominant kind of guy, and just like I wanted to go out and cause scenes, and at the same time I've worked with enough people who are like, we don't need another angry white guy showing up and shouting all the time, and so I just felt like there was no place for me trying to figure out what I'm doing in this time. So we're heading into that sort of the third week of January. Again, I don't know, Lisa or David, is there anything you want to add about what this time was like?
Well, I do want to say that this was probably the most intense time, when the number of raids were spiking. Greg Bovino, we haven't mentioned him, but Customs and Border Patrol fascist, basically the work husband of Stephen Miller, shows up to really just be bashing people's car windows, holding up tear gas and throwing it at people, arresting people on absolutely no pretense. I want to go back to Renee Good because she was the beginning of this section. Your national people should know that Renee Good and her wife and their child, they attend a public charter school, I believe, in one of the southern Minneapolis or one of the southern suburbs. And they had actually gone through some legal observer training, which is why she was in the car and why she had the presence of mind to basically watch ICE, which at the time was super concentrated in this area of South Central Minneapolis, Park Avenue, 34th Street, which is where Renee Good ultimately got killed. But she had been trained, and she was trained that it is legal to observe ICE. And for people around the country, I don't know if your listeners have this mindset, but for people around the country go, well, why didn't you just let them do their jobs? Why didn't you just, you made it worse by watching them and gathering and blowing whistles at them. Well, dudes and gals and NBs, we had had 2 solid weeks of them via Bovino abusing the hell out of everybody and absolutely illegal, absolutely unconstitutional. I have a grandson who's in daycare. One of the staff members of that daycare on a weekend, not when she was working at the daycare, was arrested. But what they did is they bashed her window in. She had glass in her face. She was taken to the Whipple building, which is a federal building that was repurposed as a temporary concentration camp, left there for 4 days without medical treatment before we were finally able to get her out. So when you talk about freaking out, Chris, this is the worst 2-3 weeks of the whole thing because we do not know where they're going to stop, and they're taking great joy in it. The Roosevelt incident at Roosevelt High happened in the adrenaline rush of the federal agents killing Renee Good. It was the same day. It was the aftermath of that when everybody's endorphins were just spiked. Everybody's adrenaline was spiked. It was chaos and craziness.
Christopher,
Yes.
you and I had been talking about this earlier, just for my own, I feel I have a certain feeling for Renee Good because I'm a white woman like her. I have kids like her. I had for, maybe a week, 2 weeks, had been doing patrols, with my car. And I never really came across anything at that point, with the exception of one time. And that at that particular instance, I got there right as the agents were driving away with the people in it. And what I would do is I would work as one of these people who would check license plates while I was doing other things at home. And she got shot, and I saw the signal chats, and I thought, oh my God. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. And that sort of was a bit of a wake up call to me.
Yeah. And I mean, we didn't explicitly mention Signal being incredibly important for all of this, a tool that provides actual real authentication encryption, communications encryption. And one of the things that I would add to what David said, Lisa, that you just reminded me of is that we're also seeing reports and speculation and all kinds of other things and not really sure how bad things are. What are we not seeing? I mean, the number of stories of someone where one observer happened to grab the name of someone who was being abducted. I remember a young woman who I believe was Somali descent, maybe Ethiopian, was taken in St. Paul, and her parents were trying to figure out where they were because the people had gotten her name, but they had to wait until the parents were kind of asking around to say, our daughter went to the store and never came back, and we don't know what happened to her. And so there's Chong Li Tao becomes famous in St. Paul. He's an elderly man who is taken out in his underwear in like 10-degree weather after they bashed his door in without a warrant. And so like you said, David, I think it's important to note that because this is a time when, from what we can tell, the goal is to terrorize immigrant communities in order to encourage self-deportation and also to try and get them to and also try to like grab them and scare them. It's also trying to provoke, we think, a response, a violent response that would then justify an occupation, a military occupation. And so there's all these thoughts that are clouding around at that time. But Minnesota, and a lot of this is happening in Minneapolis. It hadn't yet spread to the suburbs as much. It's a little bit in St. Paul and Minneapolis,
There
but I
was
think it's
stuff
still
going
mostly
on in
core.
Richfield.
Okay, so so some of the core suburbs were getting hit then too.
Right. Both my kids are people of color. One is trans, and so we were incredibly on high alert. And in order for me to get one of my kids to their job, we have to drive through Richfield. And I did come across a few incidents there on the way. And again, it was, coming up on this after it's all over with, and there's not really anything you could do at that point. So it was just really scary.
Yeah. And Chris, I just wanted, again, for national listeners, I want to kind of contextualize some things. I think overall, there was more intensity in Minneapolis than anywhere else. St. Paul also had intensity, maybe a little bit less. But we have some inner ring suburbs. Richfield is one. Columbia Heights, where Liam is from, is another one that are significant minority percentages, more than, say, the neighborhood of South Minneapolis that I personally live in. And so the shape of this at that time was, I don't know how far into the second ring suburbs and the third ring suburbs they got, but for sure, the first ring suburbs that more and more resemble what people think the city is, there was definite action at that point. But for Bovino, who wanted the big stage, he and his cronies definitely concentrated on South Minneapolis. It's a little bit trickier over in St. Paul because actually the significantly high percentage of minorities live in East St. Paul, and St. Paul is the eastern city of the Twin Cities region. And so, honestly, I think Bovino wanted the TV cameras, and he wanted to make sure that he was in an area where they would be, and that meant central, and that meant high immigrant population, and that meant Renee Good getting killed. And then not long after, Alex Preddy, who was killed in the Whittier neighborhood, a street called Eat Street. And that happened the day after 50,000 people at least had shown up to peacefully demonstrate in the general strike in downtown Minneapolis on one of the coldest days of the year. I know that got some national attention, and as somebody who was in that protest, I can tell you it was really cold. But it was a brilliant day. I'll just leave you with this. It was a brilliant day because Fish, are making a great point about how sort of atomized people felt, like they were trying to plug in, but if they hadn't been trained as legal observers, they maybe really didn't know how. I mean, Renee Good getting killed was an outrage and a tragedy, but Alex Preddy getting killed was the one that convinced everybody this wasn't a one-shot deal, and this was everybody into the defense of the city right after we had actually chosen to show solidarity and be helpful downtown. And that is when, that's when the lines were drawn, and the population was all in, I felt.
I agree. I've been trying to figure out how to plug in with my set of skills as a photographer, and I'd started going to. I finally felt safe enough with my family to go to Whipple with the phone numbers on my arm, and to take photos of license plates and attempt to help in that manner. There's a whole process that was sort of not everyone knew every aspect of it. I certainly didn't. But I take photos that generally help then people that were checking license plates to identify vehicles for their level of threat. The day before Alex was shot, 99 clergy were arrested at Minneapolis St. Paul Airport. I actually was at Whipple that morning, where a group of, if I remember correctly, 50 to 70 people with shields shut down one of the roads leading to Whipple. The Hennepin County Sheriff's Office let them go for a while. We thought they were just going to let them stay there for a while. Ended up moving then to Minneapolis, and just missed the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office attacking that barricade and breaking it up. So it was a morning that it started off the day negative 40 degrees true temp, I think, and it was very cold throughout the day. I spent most of that day outside, and I got to work out from the weight of clothes I was wearing. But yeah, and then the next day to have Alex Preddy murdered and to learn more about him. That then leads also to the federal government. I mean, this is the time of to give you a sense, the American Indian movement, which has been at odds with law enforcement in Minnesota specifically for a very long time, issued a press release around this time thanking the Minneapolis Police Department for its efforts to try to help people as the federal government was doing this. It was a very weird time with different people teaming up and trying to figure out how to get through. And so in retrospect, it does seem like it's calming down a little bit after that. Bavino gets kicked out shortly after Alex Preddy was killed. You start seeing more. You get a better sense of the legal system, the judges saying this is crazy. And I think most people still don't appreciate just what a ridiculous farce it has been in the courts. Every court that has heard just about everything about this, nearly every of the challenges has been successful because the people who are here, the federal agents, were acting so lawlessly. So Tom Homan announced the end in February 12th. I just read an article that came out today, I think, about how in greater Minnesota people are being taken. There's no sense that it's over. 10 to 20 people are taken to Whipple a day, it seems. There's a constant group of people there, the Haven people. There's so many people involved that we've skipped over. So many immigrant rights groups that have really worked so hard. One other thing that I was going to note is that I had a little bit of a visibility in some of the mutual aid groups that started afresh, but existing churches just did an amazing job. Some of them, right? Some of the churches, not so much. I live pretty close to City's Church, and that's where there was a big protest there that has, had people all reacting in all kinds of ways. But for me, it was such a difference between that and the churches that were feeding 10,000 people.
I just want to jump in here, Chris, and say that I'm not. I was raised Jewish, but I'm not a religious person, nor do I darken the doors of houses of worship. But during those 2 months, January and February, I had a chance to speak at a lot of churches that had opened their doors to be places where thousands of people, 50,000. Overall could be trained as legal observers to know what not to do, to know what to do, to know how to stand up for your neighbors without causing the Insurrection Act to be used. And I've never had a better view of organized religion in my entire life because there were so many congregations. You could tell that they were welcoming congregations because they had gay flags, they had trans flags. These were I spoke at one in Cambridge, Minnesota, which is a red part of Minnesota north of the Twin Cities. And I can't say that, the entire community was down with what we were doing, but I can say that there was a welcoming congregation there, Methodist, and they were great. And so for those of you who are godless heathens like I am, I can just tell you that I have never met more people of faith who have walked their talk at this time of crisis and lived the best ethos that you can get from however you plug into whatever overarching force you have. And it's to this day, I tear up thinking about how incredible it was.
Yeah. One of the sentiments that I loved, a friend of mine had shared a picture of someone who had written on a bed sheet and thrown it out their window. And it said, first they came for the immigrants. And I stepped up because I read the rest of the frickin' poem.
Right. Right.
So I do want to, is there anything else of the background that we should cover for context for people? I mean, there's so much more, but I think that gives you a sense.
I do want to speak a little bit to your point about the immigrant-led groups doing it. One reason, by the way, that the Minneapolis cops might have been helping the indigenous community is we were all kind of our minds were totally blown by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency coming to get indigenous Americans. I mean, if you wanted no other indication that this was racist as hell, that was the one you could totally draw on. But there were a number of Latino-led groups, Unidos through an effort called Monarca, Unidos MN, MIRAC, which is another one, COPOL, which is another one. These were groups that were not led by white non-Hispanic people like Chris and me and Lisa, perhaps. But they were the ones who'd been thinking about this. They were the ones who knew about this. And they began laying the lattice work that we all grabbed onto, whether we knew or not. Maybe we grabbed onto it because somebody we knew grabbed onto it, but we never knew where it came from. So just really, again, want to underline the point that, we keep us safe. We save us. That we is not a white we. That has deep roots in this community in ways that are, if they're white Hispanic, and in many ways not white at all.
Lisa, any other thoughts before we jump into the why of why we think Minnesota was able to resist in the way it did?
I'll just second what David said. I remember going to marches with MIRAC last summer about this, and they do a great job. And COPOL had great training, observer training, which I shared with a lot of people who could just do it online, So yeah, they definitely are the leaders that we need at the moment.
So figure out who your Latino-led and your immigrant-led groups are in your community. If you don't know, don't be embarrassed. I mean, a lot of people here didn't know. There's no
It's
shame
a good
in it.
icebreaker to admit vulnerability when you're trying to calling or meeting new folks. It's a good icebreaker.
Listen, when you're training people show up not knowing what to do, but knowing that they have to do something. That is the most beautiful connection I think you can have with another human being. And you're taken so far away from a place of shame at that point that all you want to do is make sure that you speak the words that allow them not to feel shame. I mean, I always tell people that came to trainings not knowing what to do, you have taken the first step. You're here. And so again, for people around the country, I don't know where everybody's reality is, but I can tell you that in a lot of these cases, there are immigrant-led groups and others, civil rights groups that have thought about this and are talking to us and have talked to North Carolina, LA, Chicago, wherever. And so it's okay to get to know your community better. We'll talk more about this, I think, in a second. But all of these connections you have in your community, when the chips are down, they become these threads that get pulled tight protectively. And it's never too late in your community to start making those connections in advance of what's coming. That's really the lesson here.
Now, Minnesota, we have an advantage because we are, by some measures, the most civically minded state. We vote in higher numbers than anyone else. We lead in National Night Out participation. I will say there's some differences, though. I think Minneapolis is fairly aggressive in this. I don't see this in my neighborhood in St. Paul as much. We're a little bit more. I don't think I know my neighbors as well as many others do, and despite the fact I've been here for like 16 or 17 years in this house in this neighborhood. So, in talking about how Minnesota was ready to respond, and in particular, I think Minneapolis taking the brunt and then inspiring others and also offering a bit of a playbook. Lisa, you, I think, had the best theory that I've heard, and I'm not saying that you're the only one that came up with it, but why do you think Minneapolis was ready for this?
It's definitely not my theory. I am not that smart.
You alone.
But I can just speak from my own experience. And, it kind of started with COVID because I am a lot like what you just described, Chris. I only know a few of my neighbors, or I only knew a few of my neighbors, ones that might be right next door or right behind me. We watch each other's house if somebody goes out of town. But I think when COVID happened, there was more of people came outside of their houses more to socialize. So you might be out walking your dog and you'd see, a few neighbors standing there talking, and you'd start talking to them. you know? And, then when George Floyd happened, I know from my own experience, I didn't even know that my neighborhood had a group on Facebook. I'm sorry, it's Facebook, but that is where telecommunications came in. So I went ahead and joined that group. And, the next thing you know, we're all like organizing walks around the neighborhood at night because there were some outside agitators that came during the George Floyd um, protests. And, we would share tips. You need to get another hose in case you have to put something out. We heard this from, the police that you should watch for this. And that also kind of brought us together. So now we at least had a loose network. And then this happened. And I think, like David, I just love that explanation, that metaphor, when the threads come tighter when something happens. And I think that's exactly what happened here, because more of the people in my neighborhood were involved. Some of them, I think, work with some of those immigrant rights communities. And that's how I kind of got looped in, with the signal chats and with the different groups of, patrols that we did just around the neighborhood and our local food shelf and this church. And we have a couple vulnerable neighbors. And so we would give them rides to work, or help out with their rent, and all that is still happening. And I think it's going to keep happening for a long time. And I think that, this was an awful experience, which is not over, but it has had some really beautiful side effects.
David?
Yeah, I just want to underline that. I think Lisa's got it exactly right. I mean, when George Floyd's murder at the hands of police happened, I live half a mile away, and within a couple days, when the uprising really developed, the arsons that happened, mostly at commercial spaces, stopped about 2 blocks away from me. So we had drawn pails of water around my house. We didn't know if arson was going to come closer. My son, who was a teenager at the time, slept with a baseball bat out on the front porch of our house. The neighbor behind me in the alley, who I knew enough to wave at, told me, not menacingly, but basically said, "I just want you to know we have a gun in our house if something goes down." And it was one of those moments. If that neighbor would have told me that any other time, I would have gone, "Okay, we're not talking to that neighbor anymore." But in that moment, it was not a hostile act. It was community defense. And we all got our heads around that a little bit. Now, in many ways, to me, the ICE invasion was far worse, because instead of being an awful weekend, which is what George Floyd was, and admittedly a long aftermath, and we're still recovering from it. But ICE was day after day after day after day for 2.5 months. But there is no doubt in my mind that if we all hadn't lived through George Floyd's murder and what happened there, what happened in January and February here would not have been as effective. And we also, by the way, knew, maybe this is implicit, but we knew the cost of destroying our own community, which is enormous. I mean, we have not recovered from it. We were on the verge of, you could start to feel like we were recovered from it. And then, Trump got elected. So absolutely a deep connection there.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think for people to appreciate describing why your son was sleeping with a baseball bat there. I heard that story from a lot of folks. I remember at the time, employees of ours that were in Minneapolis were part of their patrols around their neighborhood. And there was this sense, and I think you said it earlier, Lisa, when we were chatting, that you don't know who to trust, right? Minneapolis police weren't friends at that point. I mean, the Minneapolis police has done a good job of trying to be more of a community ally since then, but this was at a very low ebb. In St. Paul, we felt a little bit better about the police, but obviously we had our issues as well that were not dissimilar. And I think that people don't appreciate, if you saw this from afar, even David, you said we burned down Minneapolis. I'm still not true. You said community, but I'm still not sure that that's true in the sense that, like, there were marches in which there was arson. Some of that seems to have been provocateurs. Some of it was undoubtedly people who were there and angry. I'm sure there's some of that. But I had a front row seat to where Midway burned, which is just north of me in St. Paul, a lot of minority owned businesses and a few larger national chains. And I happened to be there for most of it taking photos. Um, and the thing that struck me is that there was no protest there. There was a group of people that opportunistically tried to rob Target, flash mob kind of thing, and it spiraled in a number of different ways. And then that night, a lot of St. Paul gas stations burned. Those gas stations burned because of what I can only assume were organized crime. There were tactics in which multiple cars would show up. They would go for the scratch-off tickets, and they would try to grab the ATM, and then they would light things on fire and run away. These were not protests. And so like this is definitely a sense that we are under siege from unmarked criminal elements, as well as the police, as well as who else knows what's going on. There was a sense that law and order had left for like 48 hours.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that the reason my son was on the porch and we had the water drawn was because people were just wilding out. People who when society loses all constraints, anything could happen. As it turned out, the worst did not happen to us. Nothing happened to us, really. But absolutely, there was opportunistic, locally based crime, and I would also push back a little bit. Um, well, let me just set the scene a little bit. Lisa mentioned outside agitators. I want to absolutely confirm that. I walk, that's my exercise, and I walked all over town all during this. And I can tell you, I saw cars with Florida plates and big beefy guys with guns. They were here for some reason. Did I see them commit an actual crime? I did not. But do I think that the opportunity was there for them to be part of the chaos? They were here. It was clear. They were intimidating. The police, we've seen video of people stopping in residential areas during, this was George Floyd, firing guns in the air to trigger a shot spotter, to be able to show that the Minneapolis streets are super dangerous when it was clearly a premeditation, clearly making it seem worse. This was a real thing, but there were also crisis actors. And meanwhile, on Lake Street in Minneapolis, there's a pretty famous documented case of unmarked cops getting out of an unmarked van to shoot a guy trying to defend himself. Later, he won a lot of money from the city. At the time, it was like, can you believe those cops were in an unmarked van and they didn't have identification? And then 5 years later, it's the federal government as a matter of policy. So what you saw in Midway, I saw on Nicollet, which is the way it got closer to me. But there were just all this amazing crap that was coming together, and it was insane.
Yeah, so the trauma from that, and I think the sense that like you need to know your neighbors and need to have a plan, that set the stage, I think, as well as I think having been through that, it's one of those things that like going through the experience, you end up stronger, in just better able to respond in the moment. So when the federal government comes in then and begins acting in these ways, I think there's this sense that like there's a muscle in Minneapolis, and then those of us in St. Paul that might not have developed it, and different neighborhoods had different reactions. But I think we were rapidly like, oh, we have to do this. We need to use Signal. We can't use Facebook anymore because we don't know if Mark Zuckerberg will decide this group is illegal tomorrow, right? Like that's sort of what's happening, and that's why everyone collapses onto a technology that's safe.
That's perceived as safe. Proton mail was another one that got used. I mean, I think when we were training people, people were asking us about OPSEC a lot as this thing rolled on, and we had to say, A, we're not OPSEC experts. Maybe I should have called you, Chris. But B, you've got to assume nothing is perfectly secure, and therefore all your communications have to be as if the most hostile prosecutor is reading them to the most unfriendly judge. And people didn't get that at first. I don't think I got that at first. And eventually we saw right wingers come in and invade some Signal chats that, could only had the best security they could. Everybody was trying their best. And when that happened, mass people changing their real names on Signal to nicknames that none of us can remember anymore. I don't even know who I'm talking to sometimes on Signal. The other thing that happened again, this is for lessons learned national people. Uh, Signal was great, but for a lot of normal people, there was a very high noise to signal ratio, if you'll pardon the pun. So people got overwhelmed really quickly. And we would see people show up at trainings who were like guilty about the fact that they joined their signal network and then they had to hop off. And we had to tell them, if you're overwhelmed, if you're paralyzed, if you just, there's too much going on, it's triggering your anxieties, whatever, it's okay not to be there. Maybe you find somebody who can handle that signal and tell you what's going on or text you via a secure encrypted end-to-end text what's going on, but don't drop out of the fight because you're overwhelmed by technology. And some of the legal observing networks, what we were able to do is we were able to say, okay, you can send us the information securely, but we don't have two-way crosstalk. We're not going back and forth about whether the license plate is ICE or not. We're trying to tell people where the ICE is, and these are vetted chats. So the information that gets sent downstream to the actual people, responders like Lisa, is being vetted, and it's much easier to digest. It's much easier to know. The biggest thing we had to end up doing with that channel, being able to say this is the slow channel versus the fast channel, at least the low bandwidth channel, is we had to say, understand that people are so in the moment and so responsive, and ICE knows this too, that odds are if you respond to one of our alerts, you'll get there after it's over. Because ICE told our observers, because the ICE people aren't well trained, they said, the average time of response in Minneapolis anyway, at the height of all this was 7 minutes, which is, by the way, faster than the police responses here usually. And in South Minneapolis, where Lisa and I live, 2 minutes. Okay. So they knew that at some point, a week or two into the surge, they knew that they had to smash and grab people, that they could not linger because otherwise the whistle brigades would be there. And so anyway, that's just a giant mix of how technology affected everything.
Right. And one of the things about Signal is we're limited. I talked with Sasha Meinrath on a show about this more explicitly, about the background of Signal that people can find in the archive. But you get 1,000 max people. And so if something would happen, you couldn't get into the room. And once you're in there, you wouldn't want to leave, even if you weren't going to be active for the rest of the day or something, because you wouldn't necessarily be able to keep your spot. So there's a lot of downsides that we are trade-offs. And I mean, I would have been at Whipple taking photos earlier if I had a better sense of who I could go with. But I had promised my family that I wouldn't just go off cowboying around solo. And so I had to wait till I had someone that would be with me to go and to be active on some of this stuff. And I couldn't just find people because people had better OPSEC. There's also a lot of security theater around it that is a little bit annoying. I mean, I will say that I'm not convinced that having a different name on Signal changes the fact that these people have the best facial recognition in the history of mankind and drones and all of this. And I feel like as soon as I was at Whipple, they knew who I was, and they probably, decided that that I was no threat whatsoever. But it is one of those things that it's playing this game with you, trying to figure out what is taking a risk and what is not. But there's something about Minnesota, I do think, and I don't know, I think if they had come in April, I don't know if it would have been the same. I think that there's a little bit of once you're in the national news and we're proud Minnesotans, and you're there's going to be a general strike and a march, and it's going to be one of the coldest days in the decade, top 10 cold days in the decade, perhaps. Yeah, I'm going, I'm going to clear the calendar. So I do feel like there's some of that resistance that came about, just that pride of Minnesota that started coming out some. But that wasn't there in the beginning necessarily for the people that created the foundation that people like me could then later join on to. Yeah, I mean, we're coming to a close here, but any last thoughts in terms of this? I mean, I do think I reflect back when I was helping one school set up a patrol. So they'd have they wanted a 30-second warning before ICE swooped in case they came for any of the families that were doing pickup or drop off. And I was talking with a person who had just left the teaching profession because of some of the challenges. And this is in East St. Paul. And she had a student that had, and I'm sorry, in her class, she had one class in which multiple students had lost close family members to death. And in several cases had been the ones to discover the body, her students. And she just was like, I feel like she was like, I'm a teacher. Like I can't deal with this level of trauma. And she was taking a break. And I was saying, well, at least this is kind of hopeful. And she said, we thought that in 2020 and 2021, and then 2022 and 2023 came and everyone forgot about us and kind of like in the post-COVID. And I'm hopeful that Minnesota can sustain these mutual aid networks. I know that, David, you on the regular have links to fundraisers around the mutual aid groups. There is a great need to continue to help folks that have had their lives totally disrupted from this. And I guess my expectation is that Minnesota will come through better than we had with strengthened networks, but it will still be not enough. Like there's always going to be a need to do more that we'll have to reckon with.
Personal charity, which I'm involved with now because mutual aid really is where the game is, cannot replace government, cannot replace progressive taxation. It can't. We're doing the best we can. We've done amazing work. Those of us that have given to mutual aid or organized mutual aid, the need is ongoing. The wound is long lasting. We're going to be ground down by stupid wars in Iran and federal government cuts that have only started to bite. It's dire. But again, I do think because of who we are, we're going to keep doing it. I really believe that because people have gotten, I mean, I hate to say it because it sounds self-satisfied, but people have gotten a real world high out of caring for each other, like a powerful, indelible high. And I'm not saying we won't go back to a lot of our normal lives if we're allowed to, but that neural pathway now is seared in people's brains. Good people, it's just seared. It's a highway now in people's brains. And I'm not going to be pessimistic about this moment for us as people of character.
Any thoughts, Lisa?
Yay, Dave!
David.
David!
It's
Yay,
okay.
David!
It doesn't matter. I mean, thank you. But
it's true. You're right. I agree. I mean, I think that people who kept to themselves in the past and there was no need for them they didn't think there was a need for them to help others out. And that's because things were good, as far as they knew. But once that trauma and once those needs were right in everybody's face, they realized things are not that good for everybody. And, things are really good for me. So maybe I can just even it out a little bit. And you're right. It does make you feel good about what you're doing, and it makes you feel good to see other people doing well, doing better. So I agree.
Just to put a point on the end of this, I have talked to so many people who consider themselves introverts, and they have. I can just have had dozens of these conversations where people have gone, I realized I can do this. Like, I realized I can step up, I can be more public, or I have this skill that I didn't know that I had. Again, it's an awful situation, and you almost feel guilty about talking about discovering your human potential at the worst time of your community's life. But this is powerful. This is people feeling more capable. And we've said over and over again in our trainings, there was 4,000 of them at the height. There are in Minneapolis 400,000 of us. In St. Paul, there are over 300,000 of us. In the Twin Cities region, there are over 3 million of us. And being able to paint those numbers, but see people grow through all of this. Again, who knows what the federal government's going to throw at us in the next, remaining Trump term. But we got as good a shot as we've ever had at being able to do what we can.
Yeah, I've tried to volunteer after natural disasters, and I spent 4 months in the Middle East studying peace and conflict in the year 2000 as part of a college program where I met with everyone from settlers on the extreme right wing of Jewish and Israeli society to Hamas. I met with a Hamas spokesperson with a student group, and we met with lots of folks in between. I learned a lot, and one of the things I did learn is that humans are at their best under pressure, unfortunately. I spent some time in Gaza. I spent time in Lebanon, in refugee camps afterwards, or in the camps, and so I saw a lot, and I would say that that we do our best under pressure in those circumstances. One of the things that I wanted to say that I didn't get to, I didn't work it in, is that I think one of the reasons we're able to respond that way also is some level of privilege, which is to say that, like, I knew that if I got picked up by the federal government, I was not going to be tortured, right? I would not eat for a period of 8 to 24 hours. Perhaps I would be in cold, uncomfortable circumstances. Perhaps I would be scared about what was coming next. But I think a lot of folks that were able to do what Lisa was doing, there is a sense that, like, the horrible things that the federal government is engaged in are mostly not targeted toward us. And some of us have jobs in which my bosses would not have said, Chris, you're fired for missing a shift if I got picked up and I wasn't able to work the next day. Further, I think having communications was really important. And I worry about the federal government trying to lock down. There's always an effort for the federal government to try to remove the ability for us to encrypt things so well that they cannot see it. And I feel like one of the lessons I take away from this is that free people need to have the ability to keep secrets from the government. And we need to absolutely preserve that in these communications, because in a time when there's overreach, we need that, even if it's inconvenient that some of the people that are doing terrible things are also keeping secrets that we would like to unlock. So anyway, there's two separate thoughts there that I think we can weigh with really quickly. One is I think this sense of, like, some of the people who were responding, not everyone, some people took greater risks, but when I was out there, and then, so I did a few patrols, but then I mostly focused on the photography afterwards. But when I was out there, there's a sense of, like, I'm probably not going to get shot. I mean, that's in the back of anyone's head after what had happened. But there's a sense of, if I get picked up, I'm just causing the federal government paperwork. Like, there was some sense that there was some level of protection, I think. So I don't know if that resonates with anyone else.
I agree. I mean, as I mentioned before, my kids are both people of color, and all their friends are too. And so I'm kind of like the shield, and I have no problem with that. In fact, I expect that at a certain point, we are going to have to be the ones that get picked up. And that's really going to be the only way to protect people of color, immigrants, Um, and as far as, like, what you were saying about freedom from surveillance, I feel, and we've already talked about this, Chris, I feel that we're really being surveilled. I know that there are ICE agents that still drive around my neighborhood. I see them, and sometimes they're parked on a street and they're sitting there with their laptops open. I don't know what they're doing, you know. I have a real problem with that lately. I feel like I've become much more aware of it, and it really bothers me.
Yeah, there's some that go by the school in suspicious vehicles with plainclothes, and others that go by in their full kit, and they're just trying to be seen.
Right. And there's also
I think
some that are calling themselves bounty hunters now.
right.
Well,
Well, there are
there
civilian
are
bounty
actual
hunters
bounty
now.
hunters. Yeah. We had a nice vehicle go up our block. We don't live on a very high traffic block, and what was funny about it was there were 6 cars behind him honking and using their horns, and everybody came out to blow the whistles. So yes, they're still here and they're still showing off, but we're also still showing off back at them. Chris, I just want to talk to your privilege point for a second. Um, there's absolutely no doubt, like, I have a tremendous amount of privilege. My wife is a lawyer. I'm a connected guy who used to be a journalist. People would notice me if I'm gone, for sure. Um, But I will say that Alex Preddy and Renee Good both had privilege, at least white privilege, and they got killed. And I will say that this is from the heart. I think I won't speak for Lisa or you, but I will say that me and a lot of other people who chose to get more involved for the first time in my life, I really had to have a discussion with myself about whether I was willing to die for this. And I don't want to self-aggrandize because I never came close to dying. Okay. Never saw a gun pointed at me. Nothing like that. I always said I'm on the list, but I'm probably pretty low on the list. But at the same time, if you've ever had that conversation with yourself for reasons, and again, I'm 67. The first time I had it was 67. Um, it changes you a little bit because I never thought I was willing to die for something. And maybe ultimately in the face of something, I'll flinch. But I can tell you, a lot of us had to have that conversation in a meaningful way when we did not know how this was going to end. And to be able to say, I'm going to keep going, fuck it, uh, that's powerful. So again, never want to not acknowledge my privilege and the advantages that I have over people who are being brutalized and imprisoned in concentration camps. But I will say that I think this touched all of us at some deep core that goes beyond privilege.
Can I ask just briefly, and I don't want to dive too deep or put you on the spot, but like, were there any top line thoughts you had as to like, because I think a lot of people, if they're being honest, after Renee Good and particularly Alex, who, came to the aid of another person in the way that I think any person naturally would, not thinking that it would be his final minute on earth. I'm just curious, like, for you, was it more a sense of outrage? Like, was it like, what was it? Because for me, I would say like it comes from anger, and a sense of like, no, not in my community kind of thing. I don't know if you have a sense of where it comes from.
I can say that for somebody who has a diagnosis of anxiety and depression, I've been like super motivated and like day after day after day in a way that I don't think I've ever been in my life, which is really weird. Like who
Good
knew
for a
the
writer.
pill? Who knew the pill for anxiety and depression was state terror? But I will say that the one day during this last 3 months where I could not really move and could not do anything was the Saturday that Alex Preddy got killed, right after that high of the protest. I couldn't not reconcile that in my mind. I could not process it. I could not draw lessons from it. I mean, anger was almost sure, but it was almost beyond what I was capable of feeling at that point. At that point, there was sort of, I don't know, reflective trauma. And I really had to shut down and get through 24 hours before the next day. I would say it was, you know, we got to keep going. We can't let these guys win after they're killing us. And again, this is not something I've necessarily ever experienced before. Like most of the time I would tell you I'm full of crap and I'm just talking brave, but this was not that. And I think this was, some people came to this conclusion much quicker than I did, but like, oh, we're really not going to let it go now. Like we're going to use our numbers. We're going to show up. We're going to be in your face. If you want to kill us, let's see how that goes. Nobody wanted that to happen, but and it was not bravado. I can tell you with we were in a foxhole together and we just had to get through it.
I don't know if it would have been different if we felt like there was a communications blackout. I will say I took tremendous heart from the protests in Boston. I can't actually say it without having a very emotional response, but like the how they took courage from us, like, and knowing that a friend of mine and colleague, she pays attention to news in Italy, and just talking to people that are outside the country who are like, you're on the news every day. It felt more important at that point, I would say.
Well, sorry, Lisa, I'll try to shut up here in a sec. But one other thing I want to say about why I was so shut down that Saturday is the government came out right away and said he had a gun. Here's a gun.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, God damn it. Now they're going to be able to turn the narrative on us, right? We knew what they did was an outrage, but I was worried about what everybody else, your friend in Italy, Boston, wherever, I was worried about what everybody was going to think. And that trying to sort of psych out what the world was going to do was like that was when my fear took over, that we're going to they're going to lie successfully. And I was 180 degrees wrong, and I have never been happier to be wrong in that everybody saw what it was within hours, if not right away. And why was Bruce Springsteen here on Saturday? Why are we a national brand among people who at least know what we are? It's it's because of that. It's because of that day on top of a few other days.
Lisa, any reflections on any of that?
Say, um, back when there was that first raid on the restaurant Lake Street, really started my anger, and it just sort of built. And I tried to get involved in the signal chats and doing patrols kind of early on. And then Renee Good got shot, and I had to kind of step back because I thought about the fact that I had people who depended on me. You know, I gave my kids a place to live, and they needed me. But then I was at a different coffee shop with a friend when Alex Preddy got shot, and my son called me and said, "I just wanted to make sure you were okay because somebody got shot at a coffee shop." And that was it. I was just so pissed. And they came out with these lies, and it was just a big eye-rolling experience for me because of course it's not going to be true. And, I was glad that there was video, which I didn't really even want to see. I don't like watching those videos, but I did watch that, and I thought, okay, well, here's the proof. So, I didn't experience too much. I mean, there were moments of sadness, but for me, the whole thing has just been anger. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like to protest, because I can yell,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
need
that's one of
that.
the things. Whipple, the many hours I spent outside at Whipple, we met all kinds of folks from people that showed up that were like roughly, middle-aged men like me who happened to be wearing brand new boots and a brand new hat and wanted to learn more about what we were doing out there. To
Really interested in joining your signal network. Could you tell me how we had plainclothes people showing up at schools trying to fake being parents.
Yeah.
And they didn't, by the way, it didn't work.
No, I mean, that's the thing is that I feel like the parents, like, someone knows you or doesn't.
Well, this is what we had to tell people eventually was you got to rely on a network of trust. If somebody vouches for you, then you can get in. This is why people are having
Right.
trouble getting into the signal networks.
But then, so I got in a Whipple, and then a friend of mine would say, "Hey, these other two folks want to come in. Can you vouch for them?" And I'm like, I don't think I can. Like, I don't know.
I don't know them.
I can try and give you some like tips, like, but like, and it's where it gets difficult. But yeah, I mean, so I was going to say at Whipple, though, there was people that I'd run into in other aspects of my life, and it was a different side of them at Whipple. A very angry, loud, sometimes incredibly inventive side.
Dildo throwing. That was one of the best moments at Whipple when they were throwing dildos that stuck to the side of the ice cars. And you can talk about the use of humor and sarcasm and undermining tyranny. Man, that was it. That was whoever came up with that. A plus. Power
Yes.
to them.
Yeah. I think we have to end on that. I don't think there's any other way
It's a good
to
note
end on a
to end
positive
on.
note. So, yeah, and I want to reiterate, like, this has been our experience. Other people, I'm sure have some different thoughts. I'm sure I got a few things wrong here or there. But it's one of those things that we live in a time and age where more and more people can tell their stories, and I hope people will, and people can sort through it and better understand what it was like. So thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful to meet you and then to share this time with you.
Yeah, thanks for asking me, Chris, and thanks for all you do with the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, too. It's done great work over the years, and I think maybe in this moment, people will understand the importance of all that work that's been done over the decades. So thank you.
Yeah, I hope so. And folks, there's lots of ways to find mutual aid groups that will help. But I'm always happy to help steer people in a direction. But some of the groups that you named earlier, Monarcha, Copal, are wonderful places to support doing important immigrant work. As we try to make sure that, I'll just say that for the more conservative members of the audience who might have gritted their teeth through some of this, we need more people to pay into Social Security and Medicare. So if there's no other reason that we need immigrants than to soak them for their labor, that is another reason, but that's not the best. That's the dark humor that comes from Chris Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I'm sorry to my bosses for being such a pain.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Unbuffered Podcast. We have transcripts for this and other episodes available at ilsr.org/podcast. While you're there, check out our other podcasts from ILSR, including Building Local Power, Local Energy Rules, and the Composting for Community podcast. Email us at podcast@communitynets.org with your ideas for the show. Follow us on Blue Sky. Our handle is @CommunityNets. You can catch the latest research from all of our initiatives by subscribing to our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. While you're there, please take a moment to donate. Your support in any amount helps keeps us going. Unbuffered is produced by Christopher Mitchell with editing provided by me, Jordan Pittman. Special thanks to Riverside for providing the song Caveman. Until next time, thanks for listening.